Hello, everybody. Welcome to Medicine and Science on the Pod TV network. I'm Nick Palavita. I will be your host today about this particular area we're going to discuss is the flu. And the flu is a real problem, especially as we hit flu season. But what starts flu season? I mean, all of a sudden it's winter and flus come around. What happens the rest of the year? Can we stop it? Can we just, drink milk and vitamin C from orange and that everything's okay? But it becomes a real problem because a lot of people die of the flu, and we need to get some expert thoughts on this area. So we have our own resident expert, a gentleman who's board certified in internal medicine and also has some specialty in infectious diseases. And you've seen him on the Pod TV network before, and also economics with the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States. None other than Dr. Michael Patmos. Dr. Michael Patmos, help us with this flu season. What are we going to do? What are we supposed to do?
Okay. Well, good morning, Nick. Thank you to you and to your audience for the privilege of being with you this morning. I am a board-certified internal medicine physician with added qualifications in infection control and hospital epidemiology. Influenza has been a passion of mine for nearly 50 years, and I typically would give annual updates at the hospital medical staff meetings and to community groups about influenza every year around this time in my entire career. It was always one of my staple conferences that I would give, or grand rounds that I would give. In fact, in about 7 or 8 years ago, my first video on LinkedIn, it's still up there, was on influenza in 2017, where I predicted there would be a pandemic, another pandemic, and people should, be prepared for it. And I got it half right. There was another pandemic. It just wasn't influenza. It was COVID. But it's a pretty eerily presentation in that I was discussing the eventuality of a pandemic being inevitable. Well, anyhow, how did I get so interested in influenza, and what can I tell you about influenza? Well, dial back the clock to 1977. I'm a first-year medical student, University of Nevada, at Reno School of Medicine. And at that point, they would farm you out very early on in medical school, very unusually for a medical school to do this, but they would put you out in the community with practicing physicians for practical experience in addition to your classroom work. So I was assigned to Dr. Rex Baggett, an internal medicine doctor in Carson City, Nevada. And I was assigned to him for a week, and I spent a week following him around. We went to the ICU to round on his patients. And in the ICU, there was about a 27 or 28-year-old bricklayer. Guy was built like a linebacker. You could not be more physically fit, powerful, strong young guy. And he was in ICU with influenza pneumonia. And I followed the case for a week, like medical students do, and he died. And I'll never forget how painful it was to go into the waiting room with Dr. Baggett to tell his wife that her husband had died. And she was obviously a young woman with small children, and she was completely grief-stricken. And she said two things I'll never forget. One, she said, where did he get this from? How could he get this disease? And two, he was too young and too strong. How could a young, strong person die of the flu? Only the flu. Well, let me tell you, that started my interest in it, because I had to learn myself how where do people get the flu from, and how can a young person die of it? Well, you get the flu from somebody else. The flu virus doesn't fall out of the sky. It's not an asteroid. It is produced by another human being who spreads it to you. Humans host the influenza virus. We replicate it, we mutate it, and we disseminate it. It is a gift from another human being. We produce it, we make it, we are responsible for influenza, and we give it to one another. How can a young person die of influenza? Easy. If you look at the 1918, 1920 Spanish flu that killed approximately 50 million people around the world in 2 years, which was, oh, by the way, about 3 to 5% of the Earth's human population at that time, one virus wiped out nearly 5% of all humans on Earth, a subtotal extinction event. Anyhow, that virus especially killed young, healthy men. So the notion that there's, that only old people with chronic disease are vulnerable, And the young people it's just the flu, it's just a cold. No, that is incorrect. There's a huge difference between the common cold and influenza. People confuse them. Doctors confuse them. Let me tell you how influenza presents. The typical textbook case of influenza is abrupt onset. I mean, that's the dominant feature. It comes on like that. You go from feeling fine to feeling really sick in an hour. You can go from having no fever to having a fever of 105 like that. And you get tremendous body aches and prostration. And there's very little sore throat and runny nose. It doesn't present like a head cold. With a head cold, it comes on over a couple of days, sore throat, runny nose, low-grade fever. You get over it in a week or so. It's kind of a relatively mild illness. Influenza can be mild, and it can be deadly. You can die of it. About 50,000 Americans, roughly, give or take, it depends on the year, die of influenza every year. What happens when you get influenza is that it eats up your lungs. You get influenza pneumonia, and then that sets you up for bacterial pneumonia as a secondary infection. Most people who die of the flu die of the secondary bacterial infection. And by the way, everything you need to know about influenza is right on cdc.gov/flu. cdc.gov/flu has everything. It's so dense with information, it's almost hard to use, but I direct everybody to cdc.gov/flu for information. So you've asked a question, what can we do to avoid getting influenza? Well, there's only one thing that, vitamin C is not going to do it. There's only one way that you can reduce your chances of getting a flu and reduce your chances of being really sick and potentially dying of influenza, and that is vaccination. Flu vaccines are about 30 to 50% effective in preventing you from catching the flu at all. That's pretty good, actually. And they're about 80, 90% effective in preventing serious disease and death. So much like the COVID vaccination, the primary purpose is to prevent you from morbidity and mortality, and also will reduce the likelihood of getting it. It's all a matter of viral load and the inoculum effect, whether or not you overwhelm your immunity. So vaccination against influenza is essential. And who should be vaccinated? Well, only people who are vulnerable to the flu. Who's that? Everybody. There is no non-vulnerable group. All groups are vulnerable. Anybody can get influenza and die of it. Happens every year. So who should be immunized against influenza? Everybody over 6 months of age. Just go to the CDC website and it's right there. But so what about side effects? Aren't there terrible side effects? No. Influenza vaccine is very well tolerated. The side effects are very mild. You're talking about a little soreness of the arm, maybe a little, feel a little punky for a day or so. That's nothing. That's actually what you would expect. That's a good sign. It means the vaccination is working. People will say, but I got the flu shot and I caught the flu. No, you didn't catch the flu from the flu shot. You can't get the flu from the flu shot. The flu shot has no viable virus in it capable of causing the disease. What people mistake that is they get feel a little punky for a day or two and they think that's the flu. Or the more likely explanation is, what time of the year do we give the flu shot? Now, in the September, October, November timeframe. What else is going on at that time of the year? People are gathering indoors because the weather is changing. Social distancing, the distance between people decreases, and we begin to share respiratory infections. That's why there's a seasonality to influenza. It has to do with the distance between people. That's why when there's respiratory stuff, keep your distance. What happens this time of year is people get head colds. It's also the cold, you say cold and flu. It's also the cold season. People get rhinovirus. So what happens is people get a flu shot. A week later, they get a head cold. They think it's the flu and they blame it on the flu shot. That's just, association is not causation. When I would explain this to patients, I would say, if we gave the flu shot on July 3rd, on July 4th, there's fireworks. People would say, oh my God, I had the flu shot. The next day there was fireworks. They must be connected, right? Association is not causation. Finally, everyone over 6 months. So there is no evidence that vitamin C or any herbal things prevent influenza. Influenza is a bad disease. not as COVID is worse, way worse. And by the way, there's some people out there, including a doctor I argue with on LinkedIn, who says COVID is the flu and the flu is good. No, they're not. COVID is a beta coronavirus. It's way over on one side of the table of taxonomy of viruses. Influenza virus is a member of the Orthomyxoviridae group. It's a completely different virus, totally unrelated to COVID. The flu is not COVID. They're two different diseases. They can look alike, but they're very different. COVID is a much more lethal disease, has 10 times or more the mortality rate of influenza, and so we need to know the difference. So the flu is not a head cold, and it's not COVID, and you should be vaccinated. I have been vaccinated every year since 1977, since I saw that young man die of influenza. And I just got my flu shot and my COVID booster a couple weeks ago, same day. So anyhow, that's the presentation for today. I'm happy to entertain and talk, and discuss it and answer questions and have back and forth.
We brought in Rick Brosner.
Hello.
Maybe he can help.
My wife has had us get vaccinated against the flu every year for at least the past 20 years. I haven't had the flu in decades. I continue to mask because the COVID numbers continue to be not great. We're in the middle of a lull, but that's an annual lull that over the past 3 years where it peaks right about the time school starts, end of the summer. Then it calms down, and then it super peaks at around the holidays, Christmas and stuff. So, I feel a little weird still masking because in my 20s, I tried to be a cool guy so I might get laid every once in a while. And so when I don't look cool, but then I remember, oh yeah, I've been married for 30 years, and even without the mask, nobody would be hooking up with me.
Yeah, but Dr. Patmos, this is kind of, to me, a very staggering figure. 50,000 people a year in the United States die of the flu. How
As
can
much
it be
as
so?
some
That's
years
a
it's
lot
a
of
little
people.
less. Yes, it's a lot of people. Some years it's less.
Yeah.
Some years it drops down, but it's tens of thousands every year. It bounces around 20, 30, 40, 50. Yeah, but that's in the
There was
ballpark.
1 year recently when it was almost nothing. It was, I don't know, like 5,000. That was 2020 when we were all wearing masks because of COVID.
Yeah. So when people say, people disparage masks, there is good retrospective evidence. There isn't a lot of prospective evidence. Prospective evidence is better. Retrospective evidence is more subject to confounding biases, but there is pretty good retrospective evidence, some prospective evidence that masking helps. It's not perfect. People take their mask off and it gets loose, and you have to eat sometimes. So masking is never 100%, but it does help. It reduces the spread of respiratory infection. There's no question about it. Also, social distancing does matter. The 6-foot thing was not made up by Anthony Fauci. That's a standard principle of infection control going back 100 years. We know that the greater the distance between people, the less likely you are to share respiratory infections.
Yeah, but shouldn't that be just self-evident? In other words, if somebody isolates themselves completely from people like I do, I'm on the internet all the time in my computer room, so I don't see people. The odds of me catching a disease from another person is pretty small. Wouldn't that be true? In other words,
Yeah.
I just don't spend any time with people.
If you were a hermit living on,
Exactly. Right.
Living on an isolated island by yourself, you'll never catch a respiratory infection. Where are you going to catch it?
Yeah. So empirically, the greater distance you have from people, or the more isolated you are, the less chance you'll actually have of getting it. But I did take the flu shot because I had experiences like Rick did. In my 20s, I didn't get it, but I started hitting my 30s, I started getting it. I got real sick. And every year since then, I've taken the flu shot because I honestly like to breathe. I'm asthmatic, and it shuts my lungs down. It's not very fun. But what gets me, Dr. Patmos, 50,000 people die. Do they have stats on how many died with the flu shot and how many died because they didn't take the flu shot?
With the flu shot, it's on the CDC website, but
Okay.
Without taking a minute to look it up, my gestalt is about 90% protection from death. If you're
Right.
immunized, you're about 90%, 95% protected from. You might still get the flu, but it'll be an attenuated case, and you're very unlikely to die. See,
Yeah.
in medicine, there's no always or never. Nothing's 100% in
Right.
medicine.
But
They
what you're
also
doing is
teach you
you're putting the
like
odds
that.
in your favor. Dr.
They
Pappas,
also
you're
teach you
putting
that
the
in
odds
couples
in your favor.
in
Say again?
couples counseling. They will tell you don't use always or never language with your spouse. That's a
Yeah.
ticket
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
you always do
But-
this. No, so
But again, you're putting the odds in your favor. I mean, if you're a mathematician, you try to do everything you can in life to put the odds in your favor because the odds charts move out there all the time. For example, if you go 100 miles an hour down the street, you just put the odds probably not in your favor that if you got in an accident, bad things would happen. So you're an odds-on favorite. It sounds to me if you take the flu shot, that was my bet. So I took the flu shot before I came to Spain because I know I'm in an aircraft with all these people around, and I have no idea what they have and what they're going to distribute. Same thing with the COVID shot. I took that before I left too because I'm going like, they could all, I mean, who knows how many people have COVID? You could just catch it. So what gets me is that if it's so safe, it's so effective, which sounds to me all the evidence is overwhelming, and I'm an attorney, it's like overwhelming evidence is, why do people not take it?
Because we have a cadre of unqualified physicians, some of whom are frauds. They have fake credentials, phony resumes, embellished resumes, who are unchallenged. They're out there on cable TV, they're on social media, they're all over the news, and they're telling people don't get vaccinated against COVID and vaccines are bad, and they're dissing vaccines, and they're not legitimate experts, and no one is challenging them. No one says, hey, where did you go to medical school? Where did you do your internship, residency, infectious disease fellowship? Are you board certified? No one challenges them. In many cases, these doctors don't have those basic credentials. They're frauds, and they are controlling the narrative. They're the ones getting all of the attention. They're the ones who are appearing on the Tenet Media, Russia-funded YouTube channels. Legitimate doctors, legitimate experts are vilified, marginalized, attacked, have their lives threatened. And meanwhile, these bottom dwellers who don't even have the right credentials are somehow, they're able to get on TV and nobody challenges their credentials. Anyhow, that's why they're spewing misinformation about immunization and vaccination. And Robert F. Kennedy is the ringleader. Now, he's not a physician, so you can't call him, you can't, charge him with being being medically unprofessional. He's just unprofessional across the board because he spreads false misinformation. So we have a torrent of misinformation that nobody is doing anything to control.
So
Yeah.
people on the far right, people who have a lot of disposable income to sucker them out of. There's one doctor who's made $100 million selling bullshit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so there's economic incentives. But what gets me in my wonderful state of Florida, like I said, where I have 2,000 relatives, I've been licensed to practice law for 40 years now. We have a head of I guess he's the Surgeon General of the state of Florida. And my cousin used to be the Attorney General of the United States, Bill Saxby, years ago. You'd have to remember him from the Nixon days. Most people don't know Bill. Oh, you do? Oh, anyway, he was my second cousin once removed. And that's part of the reason I went to law school. My mom knew him and my grandmother knew him really well. And I only talked to him once in my lifetime. But when you see people get positions of power, this is the most dangerous thing I've ever seen. When they get positions of power and they abuse their power. And Dr. Lopatto is one of them in Florida. To my knowledge, on information and belief, he is not an expert in infectious diseases or in internal medicine. And he's saying, against all conventional wisdom that I've seen in the country, that don't take the COVID vaccine. Right. So, if I was an attorney, I am an attorney in Florida. If I had a client die of COVID, I certainly would bring suit against the state of Florida for that recommendation. So I think it's really, really sad today that we have this political weaponization by certain groups. I'm not going to name which party because I'm pretty bipartisan, but whoever it is, and they're not following the science, they're following their own party interests, which to me is not correct. So I just want to put that out there.
One quick correction. Ladapo is an internist. He's board certified in internal medicine. He has no training in infectious disease or infection control. He has a PhD in health policy and an MD degree, and he's board certified in internal medicine. But he has been so far out of the mainstream in his recommendations. His recommendations are the most medically outrageous recommendations I've ever heard from any physician. And he is a Surgeon General for the state. If a doctor ever told a patient to do what he did, that's gross malpractice.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's malpractice. But also, what was the stats in Florida? How well did they do in COVID?
I have this. I have these numbers.
Let's hear the stats.
All right. So if you do the math, since the vaccine became available in early 2021, and you look at how many people in Florida have died of COVID versus California, Florida is 220% of California's COVID death rate, which works out to be about 60,000 people who died needlessly. That if they'd been living in a state with better policies and had paid attention to reasonable recommendations, might not be dead.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to put out to plaintiffs' attorneys.
Your headline's not exactly right. 120% more death. The rate is
120% more deaths. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Let me redo that then.
So some other stats. About 100,000 Floridians died of COVID. Many of them were preventable deaths if they had been vaccinated. Florida's adjusted mortality rate for COVID was one of the worst in the country. It was not a good performance. When Ron DeSantis says we had success, he had one of the worst performances in the country. The mortality rate for COVID in Florida was over 4,000 deaths per million population. You compare that to Hawaii, which was less than half of that. So Florida had a dismal performance, and Ron DeSantis failed miserably in his management of COVID. Yeah. And for him to get up there and say that he did a great job is absolute bull.
And the history of COVID in Florida works out. It lets DeSantis lie better, because early on, if you remember, it was pretty random which states got hit. The Northeast states and California and along the West Coast got hit. It was a matter of luck. And Florida escaped the early wave of deaths. So, the great majority of Florida's deaths were in the post-vaccine era when people could protect themselves. But when DeSantis talks about their record, he's throwing in the entire history when they were lucky at first. So there's one more level of bullshit in there. So the Spanish flu you mentioned. I have a couple things. One is, you said it ran from 1918 to 1920. I suspect it kept going, but after 1920, people were just sick of talking about it, and they pretended it went away the same way a ton of people pretend COVID has gone away.
Yes.
Thing two is, look at what happened to about a third of the planet caught Spanish flu. It had known effects on the brain. It gave some people sleeping sickness or encephalitis, where it paralyzed them for decades. It was like a form of Parkinson's. So we know it fucked up their brains. And look at what happened to the world. You had fascism starting in Spain 2 years later, 1922, then dozens of countries, then a depression, then a world war. I suspect that part of the reason the world caught on fire is because a bunch of people were made stupider and angrier by the flu. I have no evidence of this, but then
empirical evidence, counselor, empirical evidence.
Okay, but then I suspect it's the same thing now with COVID. It has known mental effects. It accelerates Alzheimer's. Somebody did a study that's saying if you've had a case bad enough to hospitalize you, it was the equivalent of having your brain aged by 7 years.
Oops, that doesn't sound good. But also doesn't sound good is the question that's going around the United States and perhaps around the world, and maybe Dr. Patmos can shed light on that. Is COVID gone? In other words, because the media is not reporting COVID deaths, so hence they're not reporting it, means COVID is gone, right? Or not?
No. In terms of, we know because of, first we see the cases. I see patients every day with COVID. There's also the wastewater data. They actually sample wastewater and can detect virus in wastewater. Right now, the wastewater levels are very high in the northern tier of states. It has migrated a little bit recently from south to north. And also, we know from surveillance testing from nasal swabs, roughly about 12% of people are infected with COVID right now, whether they know it or not. And that shows up in wastewater. So the important thing to remember is, like, say, where does COVID come from? It's just like influenza. It comes from us. We are the human host reservoir. What's a human host reservoir? A reservoir is like, think of it as a bank where the virus is kept and stored and maintained. That's us. We keep, maintain, and store this virus, the COVID virus. We reproduce it. And then within us, it mutates into new forms of the COVID virus, and then we spread it to one another. It is the host reservoir that's responsible for the ongoing COVID surges. No, COVID is not gone. We're still losing about 1,000 Americans a week to COVID, about 50,000 a year, which is way less than it was, but we're still losing about 1,000 a week. It's not gone. And I'm starting to worry now that what we're going to have is never ending COVID. The COVID will never go away. As long as there's a host reservoir that's maintaining the virus in existence, we're going to continue to mutate it, disseminate it, replicate it, ad infinitum. It becomes part of our daily experience. COVID may never go away.
I know you're ending
Right, quickly, one reason.
But I just had a quick question. Does it mean that we're going to have our COVID shot the way that we do our flu shots? And that's what
Yes.
you're predicting. It'll be the COVID shot literally we'll have to get the injection every year or maybe twice a year or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Because the virus that's out there now is different. It mutated. It's just, think of generations. These are like billions of generations. You're not your great-grandfather or your great-great-grandfather. You're a different generation. You've changed a little bit. So too, the COVID virus today is not your grandfather's COVID virus from 4 years ago. It has mutated. You need a new vaccine.
Yeah, and there's a reason. It's because COVID and viruses in general are crappy. They barely work. They work only well enough to infect you. And the process where they replicate themselves, which is kind of complicated. They hijack your cells and turn them into little factories to make more of them. That's a very evolution only makes stuff that works well enough to keep going. So, like, you notice that our bodies turn to crap after we're past childbearing age. It's because evolution doesn't care. So evolution has made a crappy virus that when it replicates, it doesn't always get it right. It makes mistakes, but it still is able to replicate. So the mistakes mean it's shaped different and it's able to evade your immune system. And so you need to keep getting new vaccinations year by year.
Here's what I fear. What I fear is people getting influenza and COVID simultaneously. That's a very bad situation. And that's likely to happen this year because we have people nobody's getting COVID vaccinated and nobody's getting the flu shot. The rejection of vaccines is enormous right now. Less than 20% of people are getting vaccinated. What you're going to see, mark my words, is people with double infections, COVID and influenza. Good luck with that.
But the real problem.
That's likely how COVID originated. That in some freaking animal, this bat or some freaking weird raccoon dog in China gets sick with two viruses at once, and because viruses are stupid and crappy, they mistakenly exchange genetic material, and out pops COVID.
But the real problem is if the media doesn't report it in people's brains, it has gone away. And so that's one reason we want to make sure we report it on the Pod TV network. And we're also going to go away because we're at the half hour. I want to thank Dr. Michael Patmos, who is board certified in internal medicine, bringing the real world to us, and hope this will help you out in making your decision, to your right decision, which is to take the flu shot and take the COVID shot. And we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.